Welcome to the webinar, The World is Not Flat, so why are our textbooks? My name is 𝘬𝘬𝘭𝘥 and I am the Associate Director of the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language and Literacy at the University of Arizona. Thank you all for joining us. As a little backstory, Dr. Lord was going to join us in person in the fall as part of our LILAC initiative, Literatures, Languages and Cultures in the 21st Century. We had to postpone that to the spring, and then her rescheduled event was waylaid by the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Lord joins us today in lieu of that event with a topic that's perhaps particularly relevant to the online teaching world in which we now find ourselves. Today, our guest presenter is Dr. Gillian Lord, Professor of Spanish and Chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at the University of Florida in Gainesville. For many years, Gillian directed the Spanish language program there. Her research focuses on the second language acquisition of Spanish, study abroad, and technology. She has also worked in the areas of teacher training and classroom learning. She recently co-authored with Dr. 𝘬𝘰𝘳𝘵𝘆𝑚𝑜ndo an all-digital learning program called Contraseña for beginning learners of Spanish. In her webinar, Gillian's going to argue that the paper-based textbook has outlived its usefulness in today's world, both logistically and pedagogically, and that the change we need in terms of how we teach cannot fully take place until we change the materials we use to teach. After her presentation, we'll have a Q&A during which people will be able to use the chat function and the Q&A to post their questions. With that, let's get started.
All right. So this is really weird for me because I can't even see who's here. So I also am not a huge fan of the webinar thing in spite of my background in technology. So I will do my best. I have actually done a little more text on this PowerPoint just because I know there's no face interpersonal interaction. So it'll be, I hope, easier to follow that way. And I'm gonna close down the video. Okay, so like we said, the world is not flat, so why are our textbooks? Before I begin, first of all, thank you for having me this fated visit that seems not to be able to happen, but hopefully one day. But I'm glad to be able to join you all this way. Everything I'm going to talk about today is about the textbook that you mentioned. I'm having a hard time moving there we go. So this is 𝘬𝘰𝘳𝘵𝘆𝘆𝘐𝑚𝑜ndo. She's my co-author for that textbook, but we also did an ACTful presentation with this same title, and we have an article published with this same title. So I don't want it to sound like I'm the sole author of any of this. Everything I'm talking about today is stuff that Amy and I have worked on together and for years talked about together. So, okay, so I want to start by talking a little bit about sort of the state of the situation with textbooks, language textbooks, and how that relates to what we teach in our language classrooms. So I first want to start with I don't know why it's not letting me switch. There we go. If you can see my little cartoon here, if any of you have taught language at the beginning levels, I think this will probably ring true to you. Said I took 2 years of Spanish. I didn't say I could speak it. And this is sort of the root of everything that Amy and I set out to do, this idea that, you know, when you finish your language courses, whether it's a requirement or whatever, you really have to be able to use the language and not just be like, yep, I conjugated a verb or whatever. So with that in mind, looking at the role of the traditional language textbook, for the most part, we have relied on whatever textbook is in use in our program to determine our curricula. When you write your syllabus, you don't usually say, what am I going to do this semester? You say, how does the book lay this all out? And this is not a surprise. I'm sure you've all noticed this. People have written about it. The other kind of issue that goes along with this is that these language textbooks that we use have traditionally followed what we call a coverage model, this idea that you have to get all the grammar points ever known crammed into one textbook. And it is a grammar coverage approach. You know, we choose topics to go with that, but it's really about, you know, do you include the preterite imperfect, the subjunctive, the whatever. And there's sort of this vicious cycle because publishing houses keep publishing them, but instructors keep adopting them because except for a few really talented and motivated people, it's really hard to create your own materials in any given semester. So we do rely on the textbooks. And you know, publishing houses then don't have any incentive to change if they have these bestsellers that we keep buying. So this, not a surprise, of course, means that we end up excluding sort of that meaningful context that brings together the language class because we're so focused on getting the grammar covered. So if we look at our textbook and let that decide how we're going to be teaching, we end up having classes that are focused on skill development, but with a real emphasis on oral and oral modalities. This is sort of the fallout from the communicative approach, where we're very concerned about the sort of spoken communication. And this is fine, except that reading and writing then are treated as these wholly separate skills and often independent of any audience or context. Content in our textbooks tend to be self-referential, all about me, my favorite classes, my schedule, my family, whatever. And definitely focused on sort of that practical transactional language use, you know, how to survive in the target country. And this is something a lot of people have commented on. I'm sure it's not a surprise that culture is then this fifth skill kind of added on, but not integrated into the other skills. It's seen as separate and it's treated very incidentally. And I'm as guilty as the next person of having, you know, if you run out of time in your class, culture is what you skip. Because again, we're so worried about getting all those grammar points done and covered that we'll leave aside things like culture. So because of this, we see students who are really not engaged by these materials, and this means that after a language requirement course, for example, they don't go on, they don't continue to take the language. And in this day and age, declining enrollments and where, you know, student credit hours or whatever version you have at your institution are the currency of the day, this is important. We need to engage the students so that they keep taking our classes. They don't enjoy class, they're bored, they see it as a chore. Homework is seen as busy work. They really often don't see the connection between what they're doing at home and what they'll be doing in class, or what they're going to be tested on, right? So that they end up just working towards the test, memorizing those grammar points so that they can finish the test and consider it complete, but the learning is sort of not the real goal anymore. And like that cartoon in the beginning, they do feel unprepared to use Spanish. And of course, Spanish are my examples, but we could be talking about any language. You know, if in spite of this focus on sort of transactional, they don't feel prepared to really go out in the world and actually use the language. This is just a side issue and not something I'm going to talk a lot about, but the cost of textbooks is ridiculous these days, and it keeps getting higher. And so this is something I think that just ethically we all have to consider when we're looking at materials or designing materials, is keeping it a little more affordable and accessible. So this need for new approach, you know, all this leads up to, and this is where Amy and I got to know each other and start talking about what would that look like and how could we really make a program that would do what we want it to do and let us teach the way we know we should be teaching. So we're not alone. There are increasing criticisms of this sort of status quo. And this one quote is a really great way to sum up sort of the challenge, but also the opportunity, that ideas and concepts should anchor the intellectual and linguistic trajectories of our students. So we know there's this challenge that we have grown-up students with grown-up brains and more or less grown-up critical thinking skills, but their language skills are still much lower. So how do we engage them with the language skills they have, but also speaking to that sort of grown-up mind they have? And so what Amy and I wanted to do, what we set out to do, was find an approach to language materials that would let us, so an approach that is informed by SLA research and by sort of professional guidance thinking like the MLA 2007 report, that takes advantage of what digital can do that print can't, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but But what all this really comes down to, the technology is the tool that let us do certain things, but it's really about finding the best tool to teach the way we want to teach. We want to provide a meaningful experience for our students. We want to empower teachers to test the way they teach. And this has always been a big one for me, because I never felt like I was good at testing the way what we were doing in the classroom. So in class, we talk, we communicate, we do pair work, and then we give them a multiple choice grammar test. So there was a real mismatch there. We want them to use the language. We want them to actually come out of the class with an ability to use language. And again, whatever our approach was, we wanted to be sure to address issues of affordability and access. And so what I'm talking about today, the examples I'm giving you, come from Contraseña, which is the product that we came up with and published last year. There's a long history, and I won't go into it, but I will say that this project started with one of the large publishing houses that approached me to ask if I wanted to do this. And after about 3.5 years of working together and with this company, Amy and I realized that it wasn't going to be possible to do what we wanted to do with a big company that really wasn't ready to change. A lot of it, there is difficulty in trying to conceptualize something fully digital, and both we and the company had challenges doing that, but we ended up leaving that company, and this is now published with a small startup company called Lingual Learning that works only in digital, because they also have a real commitment to affordability. So the examples I'm going to give you come from this, but they're really just examples of how we're putting into practice all those lists of things that we want to be able to do with our teaching materials. Okay, so Contraseña is this whole program, and I'm not going to go into great detail on all of this, but some of these things are what I'm focusing on today in terms of kind of what we want materials to do. And I am trying to condense this into 4 key features that I'll talk about. One is the digital interface, and this is kind of especially relevant now that we're all trying to teach remotely, but the digital interface is, again, just the tool. I mean, the idea is that you can teach face-to-face, hybrid, online with these materials, with any materials. They should be adaptable. We'll look at how we interpret the transformed approach from that MLA 2007 report. Talk about our focus on outcomes and visible learning, how we want students to really recognize what they're learning. And then how to make good use of our time, both the instructor's time and the student's time, and our limited, the limited time we have with our students, really. So I'll go through each of them, and then I have some examples and then a little bit of data to show you what outcomes look like. And it's about 35 minutes, so hopefully I'll stay on track. Okay, so like I said, this is an entirely digital program. It was conceived as digital from the ground up. So this was not a book we wrote and then put it into an ebook platform. It was from the very beginning designed with multimedia as integral to everything we wanted to do, both in terms of like pathway as well as content and presentation of content. It is mobile adaptive. This is really important. I'm watching my kids now at school, at home, doing everything, writing compositions on their phones. So we knew that we needed to be able to, it needed to be able to work on a variety of platforms. And like I mentioned briefly, we wanted it to be suitable for all delivery modes. So it's, we tend to think, oh, it's digital materials, it's for online. It works very well for online, but it also works face-to-face and hybrid. So that's the first one. The second, our transformed approach from the MLA. One of the key takeaways of that 2007 report was that we need to be focusing on fostering translingual, transcultural competence, this ability to operate between languages and cultures, that we can't hold our students to this sort of educated native speaker norm. We want them to be, you know, functioning users of the language. Following their guidance in the report, the content in our program is text driven and looks outward. So it's not just self-referential about the student. We start a little bit, the first half of the program is inward looking, But then the second half is outward looking and having the students sort of situate themselves in the bigger world. Culture is, we recognize that it's fluid and context bound. It's not the sort of monolith. You know, especially in Spanish textbooks, we usually have, you know, chapter 2, or, you know, that chapter 2 is the school chapter and it focuses on Mexico, and then chapter 8 is the food chapter and it focuses on Spain or whatever. So we didn't want to limit it like that, but we also wanted it to be integrated throughout the materials. And then wrap the textual within the communicative. So we don't want to get rid of this idea of communication being one of our key goals, but we wanted to take that further. And so we take the textual, which I'll talk about in a minute, as sort of the basis for language use, both in the program and in what the students will do beyond the program. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about skills and strategies, but that's sort of my baby in the program is our real conscious focus on giving students strategies to use language. Because, and I say this all the time, but I feel like students don't know how to be good students, especially in languages. They may have perfected studying for chemistry and calculus, but when it comes to learning a language, they need to approach things differently. And I think we really need to be a lot more overt and a lot more intentional about teaching them the strategies they need to do that. So from the text-based approach on the last slide, we're looking at it as literacy informed. It's not going to be a pure multi-literacies approach, but we're taking the tenets of that and adapting it. So each unit in our program is driven by a text, an anchoring text. And by text, we mean in the broadest sense. It can be written, it can be oral, it can be video. And in our units, the odd units are written and the even units are oral. So in every 2-unit chunks, you get all 4 skills. We've looked at a variety of genres, both to interest the students, but also to show them how language is used in these varied contexts. And over the course of the program, these texts increase in complexity and authenticity, so that by the end, they are fully authentic, real texts. And so, like I said, the units are text-driven. Each unit starts with the text, which gives examples of the language and the culture in context. And then throughout the text, we kind of deconstruct that, show them the language, the vocab, the grammar, all of that. And then the end of the project, that other bookend, is the end of the unit, sorry, is a mini project that they do. Either it's creating their own version of that initial text or taking that text a step further. And I think I have, yeah, so just to give you an idea of what this looks like in Contraseña, you have the introduction where we talk about the goal, we give them the strategy, it's a comprehension strategy, so either reading or listening. Then they have the text, and we take that vocab grammar, then the culture, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and we give them a productive strategy so that at the end they can do this final project. And I do have some more examples as we go, which will make more sense. But so to give you this idea of the sort of variety of texts that we use, these are the authentic texts. One of them is a graphic novel. One of them is a newspaper. This one from BBC Mundo happens to have a video on the website that accompanies it. So it's a great multimedia idea. We have one of those, a micro story, microcuento, and we have a short film. So there's a whole range of stuff that will engage the students, also show the students that, you know, in this case, Spanish is used in every way that we use English as well. And like I said, the strategies, the receptive strategies, prepare them to understand the text. So we give them the reading comprehension, the listening comprehension, and then towards the end, before they do their project, we give them the productive strategies. In the written units, those are spelling and sort of writing techniques, you know, brainstorming or semantic mapping. And in the oral units, it's pronunciation focus, and then speaking strategies, whether that's, you know, giving a presentation with notes or using discourse markers and fillers to sound more native-like. So we have the whole range throughout. Okay, so that was number 2. Number 3 is this focus on outcomes. we have clearly articulated level goals, and not just at the level, but within each subsection. And we make those really clear to the students so that they know why they're doing what they're doing. We have it's an adaptive interface, not entirely adaptive like we see with other disciplines, but it focused on sort of mastery-based learning, so that if they get to the end of a sequence and they do well enough and know they're ready to go on to class the next day, that's good. If they're not, if they don't achieve a certain level, we point them to other materials to help them get ready. Because we know that everyone comes with a different background, a different skill set, and honestly, as long as they get to the end point, it doesn't matter as much to me the path they take to get there. So some people may need more work in some areas and others less. So our end of unit projects are intended to serve in lieu of exams. Not everyone who's using the text does it that way, but I think most are. So the projects allow them to showcase what they have learned, and instead of the tests where I feel like we're trying to catch them in what they haven't learned. And this way they can, you know, document the learning that has gone on in the unit, but we're not like penalizing them for not remembering that specific preposition. So all of this is based on the tenets of backward design, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with backward design, but I will just go through it very briefly. So the first, you know, you want to identify your results, right? You start where you want to end up. And so we did this for everything from the whole text on down to the section level. So, you know, when we set out to write the scope and sequence, we set out to figure, we wanted to figure out what it is that a student needs to know at the end of one semester or 2 semesters of language study. From there, you determine how you would know that, what evidence you need to show that the student has achieved that results. And only from there do you go and plan the learning experiences, right? So even within each unit, you know, what do we want them to learn? Well, and how will they showcase this in the project? And then we work backwards. What grammar will they need to be able to do this project? What vocabulary will they need? What cultural understanding will they need? And then that's how we built the units. So it ends up, I mean, in a lot of ways, what we ended up with as a final product shares in common a lot with many other textbooks. You know, there are things that just have to be covered in all textbooks, but there are also things that we don't have, you know, the little nitty-gritty grammar points. The order that we do things is a little bit different, but it's all then contextualized, which was one of our big goals. So this relates to that goal of making learning visible to both students and instructors. The units are sequenced to facilitate the content outcomes and communicative as well as cultural and linguistic. And then, like I said, we have this summative activity for each unit that allows them to showcase what they've learned throughout the unit. But this is all put together into a portfolio that can actually be exported for students or instructors. So it's a great way for the students to look at their own progress as well as the instructors. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this emphasis on assessment. So, you know, the more and more sort of artifacts you need to document the student learning outcomes, this makes it possible to do that. And again, the big one, this allows us to assess the students in the same way we're teaching the students. So there isn't that disconnect between what they're doing at home and what we're doing in class and then what we do on the test. And then the last one is just to make best use of our time. This is super obvious and you're gonna say, well, of course, when I show you this, but out of class, students spend time preparing, and then in class, students spend time communicating. This is, I think I have this here. No, this is the hallmark of the hybrid or the flipped model. But the reality is our current textbooks, for the most part, make it really hard to teach that way because students expect to be taught grammar, but also the flow of the textbook doesn't really make it clear, this is what you should be doing in your class, this is what you should be doing at home, and why. And so this is this artificial division I mentioned before between when language is presented, when language is practiced, when language is used, and when language is assessed. So we try to make that a much smoother connection, so that the work they do at home or in class, but especially at home, doesn't seem like busy work to them. It doesn't seem like this kind of meaningless, I'm doing this because it's on the syllabus, but I don't understand why. So just a few examples to show you how we do this. So out of class is everything. All the instruction is done in the program, but designed to be done out of class. So we have, it's a 3-step approach: prepare, apply, and check, I guess, verify. So grammar and vocab are presented comparable ways. We have an interactive video, a little, hand drawing video. And then on the right-hand side, a vocabulary list that you can hide the English, hide the Spanish, you can have the audio only, so the students can kind of go through it themselves. So that's the presentational aspect of it. Application, we have a structured sequence of activities. They tend to follow sort of input to output approach, and starting from sort of word level on up to sentence level and then longer discourse level. But we also designed it so that all activities are important, like they walk through, they develop one upon the other. And so it's from like the former LPD in me, from that perspective, you don't have to go through and decide which of the 400 activities you want to do. You just assign them as a block. And then each of these ends with a comprobar, like a verification section, where it's a multi-step activity that builds on but uses what they've already done. And this is where they get the score at the end that says, yeah, you're ready to go to class tomorrow or the next day. Or, you need a little extra work, and then we take them to that extra work so that by the time they come to class, they are ready to do their communication, which is exactly what the class is used for. So we design a series of conversation activities, and that's what class is. Your lesson planning is picking which of those activities you want to do. I think a lot of times people are scared of a digital program because they think that students are going to be on their computers all the time. But the reality is they don't need their computers. They need to just talk to each other in class, and the instructor can present it. They can print out those activities, whatever it is. But so this class looks like what we expect our language classes to look like: paired group interactions. So that's the bulk of the project. I know that's a really quick and superficial overview, so if anyone wants more detail, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But I wanted to also give you a little bit of data that we collected from a pilot study, just to show what this looks like in action, because it's all very nice and pretty to say this is what we should be doing, but we need to know if it works also. So I won't go into great detail about this. We had students from UF, where I am, and Kansas, where Amy is. In my institution, we were doing a pilot. So one section was using Contraseña and the other section was using the regular textbook. In Kansas, they're all in Contraseña already. So they had the first 2 semesters using Contraseña. We looked at different things with them. I'm just going to go over some of the basics we have. But we looked at can-do statements. They're not ACTFL's specific can-do statements, but they're based on the proficiency guidelines. And so we had students rate these 20 questions, how comfortable they felt performing certain tasks, language tasks. Their attitude survey, this was just like, how they feel about going to class, speaking in class. Is it engaging? Do they like it? Again, a scale of 1 to 7. I just got those 2 at the same time. One, I'm calling this a proficiency assessment, but it's in big quotation marks because proficiency is a can of worms that I really don't want to open. Possible to define, harder to measure. This is not really proficiency. It's more of kind of a grammar check. It's along the lines of an SAT-2 or like a CLEP test. It's 100 multiple choice items that look at grammar and vocab you'd expect students to know in 4 semesters. And then we also did a back-end analysis of how many minutes students are spending preparing for class. Because this is another thing, when we talk about the flipped model or the hybrid approach, everyone's always really scared that if the students aren't doing that work at home, what's going to happen in class? And that's true. If they're not preparing at home, then you end up reteaching the grammar and stuff in class. So we wanted to look at what was really happening. And then we have some classroom observations where we wanted to look at kind of what the interactions were like during class time. So I'll just give you the brief summary. This is the experimental versus the control, the Contraseña versus the others. Basically what we see that over the course of the semester, the experimental group gained about 38 points in the responses, so that feeling more able, more comfortable doing things. The control group also gained, of course, as we would hope. The statistics show that there's a significant group by time interaction, so the experimental group was significantly more likely to have higher ratings at the end, which isn't to say that it's better, but we do see that they are, you know, ending the semester with sort of positive attitudes. Some of these, we haven't finished the item analysis, but there's some areas where when we plot the two groups, the experimental groups post ratings are kind of strikingly higher, can't say significantly, but so a lot of this is how they communicate themselves, a lot of the culture ones, which was really important to us because, again, we felt like culture had not been treated well previously. And so things like I can use culturally appropriate behaviors. And so that's a really nice thing to know. Also, number 17, I can converse with Spanish speakers. That was another one that we were really interested in seeing, like how confident they feel doing that. The attitudes, again, this was like, I like Spanish, I look forward to next semester. Again, the experimental group showed significant gains over the course of the semester, indicating that they had, you can see they were both pretty positive, but that the experimental group was more likely to have had a bigger increase pre to post than the control group. And again, looking at some of these items, they were higher on things like, I look forward to taking, this is Spanish 2 in the future. I like the atmosphere. I look forward to Spanish. I love number 18. I really enjoy learning Spanish. That's not something we hear a lot, at least from these beginning students who are doing this for the language requirement. One thing that really struck me is the experimental group's lower rating of the item that said, I get nervous and confused when I'm speaking in my Spanish class. So they were less nervous and less confused at the end of the semester than their counterparts. And that was kind of a good one to me too. I felt like we'd done something good with that. And then again, this proficiency, just sort of this overall skills test. The control group started significantly higher than the experimental group, weirdly, just randomly. But both improved, and the experimental group improved considerably more by the end of the semester. This is a little misleading, this graphic, because statistically by the end of the semester there was no significant difference between them. So what that's saying is it's still working. You know, the outcomes are the same in spite of the fact that there were no tests, in spite of the fact that we didn't teach grammar in class, they were just doing it on their own at home as we intended, that their outcomes were still comparable. So this is really interesting. This is from the Kansas students, but again, we're looking at how much time they spent in class, out of class, preparing for the classwork. And this is broken down by the aplicar, which remember was the sort of practice sequence, and the comprobar, which was the check, the final check on whether they were ready to go to class. What's interesting here is the flip-flop, the ones on the left, the very first semester, they didn't spend as much time on the initial activities, but they spent a lot more time on the comprobar to make sure they were ready to go to class. By the second semester, those who had used Contraseña now for 2 semesters, seems like they learned that those application activities are where you really need to spend your time. So they then spent more time on those and a little less in the comprobar. What's impressive though with all of this is students spend an average of between 20 and 30 minutes a night preparing for the next day's class. And this, I mean, 20 to 30 minutes doesn't sound like that much, but it's pretty impressive, I think, that we got college students to do half an hour a night of Spanish because they knew that they couldn't participate in class and couldn't do what needed to be done in class if they weren't ready. And so this to me was this like, yes, this flipped model can work if we have the right materials. And then just this last classroom interaction. So we did, I think it was 8 observations of each class throughout the semester. And we're looking at things like talk time and use of language, Spanish versus English. And so what we're seeing, but I don't have stats, is that in the Contraseña group, the students are talking a lot more, a greater percentage of each 50-minute period is filled with student talking, whether that's student to student or a group, than in the other section. There's a study that the authors of Anda, which is another textbook, that they did a few years ago, that they calculated how many minutes students speak in your average beginning Spanish class, and it was 2 minutes out of a 50-minute period that is actually spent on students conversing. And so I wanted to see kind of what this looked like here. In the Contraseña group, it ended up being just over 25 minutes average that students were speaking, which again, I felt like that's only half the time. But in the other group, it was considerably less that they were spending. It was about 12 minutes that students were speaking. So we see increased student talk time, which goes along with decreased teacher talk time, but we also saw more Spanish used in the classroom. So not just in that student to student environment, but student to instructor also, which was also a really encouraging result. So like I said, we're still analyzing all that, but it's promising. So my conclusion, if we go back to these the guidelines that I set out, we think we have accomplished what we wanted to through these materials. They were informed by SLA research and by professional guidance. SLA research, EdTech research, best practices, the MLA report, but also our years of experience as educators and program directors. We wanted to take advantage of what digital can do that print cannot, and from the examples you saw, we really did that. Instruction is conceived entirely as multimodal with instruction and practice, as well as the projects. They have to produce videos and audio, all kinds of different genres. We do have the authentic text. The cultural collaborators I didn't talk about, but that's how our culture is presented. We have about 30 people from around the Spanish-speaking world that we interviewed for each of the topics that we covered. I'm going to talk more about that later. And the development of 21st century skills, I didn't mention this, but for the culture sections, one of the tasks in every unit is that they go and find stuff out on the internet, but we give them very specific internet searching strategies, because we've learned that our students, in spite of being the digital natives, are not as gifted at, like finding good sources or discerning what a good, reliable source is. So we needed to teach them that too. Provide a meaningful, engaging foundational experience. We focus on the content and the context, and we think we've been able to do that. We have evidence from the student data, and we see that using class time for real communication is a positive outcome for them as well. Empower teachers to test the way they teach, and I should stop saying test, assess the way they teach. So we have a portfolio of these project-based assessments. So like I said, students showcase what they know, and we don't kind of gotcha on what they don't. And again, the ability to export it for evidence of learning is a big plus also. We want students to use the language, and that is how each unit is structured. We provide models and we provide practice, and I'm going to close with an example of that in a second. And then affordability and access, again, I didn't talk a lot about this, but the digital delivery definitely lowers the cost. You don't have printing costs, but you also don't have warehouse costs where publishers have to store all the books, and delivery costs. The adaptive platform makes accessibility also relevant. And this little doohickey is on my, okay, the control panel was covering that up. And then easy and frequent updates and fixes. So if we find a typo, we can just go in and fix it in 10 seconds. You don't have to wait 4 years for the next edition to come out. That's also true, culturally, the unit we're working on now, we're writing the last 6 units. We have a whole unit on mate, the Argentinian drink. And there's some really interesting stuff going on with the traditions around mate and the sharing now in light of COVID-19, and how that might be changing this longstanding tradition. So things like that we can bring right into it because it's easy to update. And so finally, I want to just give you an example of, this is the Unit 2 project from a student. I hope you're going to be able to hear it, but this is on the gentleman on the left is Phil. He's a continuing education student in University of South Florida. He's retired. He's taking it online. So the Unit 2 unit is the, getting to know you kind of unit, and their project is to interview a Spanish speaker. It can be a native speaker, it doesn't have to be if they don't have easy access to one, but Mr. Phil tried really hard to get out of this project. He did not want to do it. He was scared to death, but I want to show you his video. Even if you don't speak Spanish, I think you'll get it.
Hola, ¿cómo te llamas?
Mi nombre es Martín, señor.
Martín.
¿Cuál es su nombre?
Mi nombre es 𝘬𝘭𝘢𝘵.
Okay.
¿De dónde eres?
Yo soy de México, del estado de Guanajuato.
Sí.
¿Y usted?
¿Usted? Yo soy de norteamericano, de Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh, ok, mucho gusto.
¿Cuántos años tú vives en Estados Unidos?
En Estados Unidos tengo más de 30 años.
Sí.
¿Y usted? ¿Toda su vida aquí?
No, yo nacida en Estados Unidos. Okay. ¿Qué vendes tú?
Yo vendo ropa vaquera.
Lo siento, no. ¿Qué significa ropa? Sí, sí.
Botas.
Y botas, sí.
Ropa.
Muchas gracias. ¿Cuántos años trabajo aquí?
Aquí solamente tengo 5 meses.
Sí.
¿Usted trabaja todavía?
No trabajo, soy retirado.
¿Cuánto tiempo?
2 meses.
¿Solamente 2 meses?
Solamente 2 meses.
Usted debe extrañar su trabajo.
No trabajo para mí. Final pregunta.
Sí, señor.
¿Quién es su cliente favorito?
El señor Felipe va a ser mi cliente favorito.
Excelente. Muchas gracias.
De nada, señor. Mucho gusto.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego, señor. Un placer.
So this, I mean, there were mistakes. It was absolutely not a perfect conversation, but he got his point across. He had like a 2-minute conversation with a native speaker. And one of the things I love is the strategy in that unit was, what to do if you don't understand. And he actually used the strategy to ask for clarification. And so this, to me, this is like, we wanted to set out to kind of make materials that let us teach the way we know we should be teaching, and that have our students learning what we know they should be learning. And this, we felt like this was our big victory. So, whoops, I don't want to do that again. There. Okay, so that is all I have. This is my round 3-dimensional world instead of the flat map that it was at the beginning. I guess maybe I should stop sharing. Did I stop sharing?
No, you're still sharing at the moment.
Stop. I don't know. It just says new share. I don't want to share.
I can stop it for you.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lord. We appreciate that. There are a few questions, so I'm sure you can see them, but I will read them to you so you don't have to go and look for that screen.
Okay.
The first one is from Francis Larson, who's a graduate student here at the University of Arizona. He said, have you any feedback on whether students are enjoying certain modes more? When you mentioned there are written and audio in 2 chapter chunks, do they have a preference for one or the other? And he's wondering if the digital delivery might make them favor the multimedia audio videos over longer textual sections.
That's a really good question. The text sections aren't necessarily longer. With those also, we do try to have a variety of genres. So one of the written, some of the written projects, one of them is an infographic, one of them is finishing that, a couple panels of that graphic novel, but then one of them is a letter, one of them is a story. I don't know. I think in the beginning, they're more intimidated by the multimedia ones. but by the end, they're so creative and they do such amazing things with the video especially, that I think they end up liking that more. But I don't have data, that's just impressionistic.
Okay. Will students have opportunities to explore cultural differences? This particular person was wondering about how this material is promoting cultural awareness through language without relying on stereotypes.
That's a really good question, and it's a challenge. You know, on the other side of this, 6 years ago, it's really easy for me to critique every other textbook, but then when you set out to do it, it's hard. So one of the things we did, I mentioned the cultural collaborators. So we have people from all over the Spanish-speaking world, and for each unit, whatever the cultural topic of that unit is, we asked those people their impressions, their take on it, and we have their exact language brought in. So it's text there, but in some of the activities, we bring in the actual audio of their voices as well. So it's not us telling you what the Cuban population thinks of X, Y, or Z. It's somebody from there. But we also, with that, tried to, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. We do sort of the traditional culture, but with a new angle. So in the unit on family, for example, the culture looks at the concept of family, but what we really focused on was marriage equality throughout the Spanish-speaking world and where that stands. In the clothing chapter, we talked about body positivity movements and how they look in different areas of the world. So we're trying to do the culture, but also at a higher level, but then get that feedback from the actual residents of that culture so that we are trying to avoid the stereotypes. And often the cultural collaborators don't agree with each other. They'll say contradictory things, which is perfect, because that shows you that you can't talk about the Spanish-speaking world or the French-speaking world or whatever as one monolithic culture, but it shows that there are these nuances throughout, even within the same region.
All right. Another question here, actually, the questions are coming in fast and furiously now. I'm asking the ones that were written while you were speaking first.
Okay.
When you say accessibility, what do you mean? Accessible to students with learning disabilities, or just more easy for students to access the material in general?
Both. So primarily the former. We had interface design folks looking at it, and there are different ways you can build your course if you do have students with different abilities. But also just different learning preferences and styles. And then I do also mean it in terms of cost as well.
Right. Okay, let me go to another one here. This one says that the person sees your project depends on separate units and modules like textbooks. Have you ever thought about that issue? Have you observed any disadvantages of that? Is a spiral approach possible in these kinds of applications? That's
a really good question. My initial goal was that it be entirely modular and you do what you want when you want it. What it comes down to, though, is if you want the language to be contextualized, you do need certain language skills to be able to talk about other things. So I don't know if it would be possible. I was not able to do it. I would welcome somebody. I think at an upper level text, even intermediate, maybe it might be more feasible, because I love the idea of the learners or the instructor choosing their own path. But at this level, I was not able to make it work, but I challenge you, you can do it.
I think this is probably going to be the last question because we're almost at 12 o'clock.
If you email them to me, I'm happy to get responses to you too.
Okay, we'll do that because there's 14 questions in here, and then I see other ones in the chat as well. So people are saying thank you, and then they are asking questions. But the last question that I'll ask right now, it said that you said that students are asked to converse in class. Are those activities different for the chapters that focus on written text as opposed to the oral text?
Ooh, good question. No, we do have, so there's also what I didn't say, there's the computer graded activities. There's also a whole subset of instructor graded activities. And for those in the written units, those do tend to look more at sort of paragraph length writing, whereas in the spoken units, it's more speaking, but obviously those require instructor grading, so not everyone assigns that. The in-class activities are designed to be oral communication. We're not calling them communicative because they're not all communicative. Like if you just practice the vocab, like so if they do just the vocabulary stuff and haven't had anything else in the unit, it's very hard to practice vocab in a contextualized way if they don't have the grammar yet, or vice versa. But they are designed to be oral. Now, a lot of them do have written elements, like as a support skill that we let them write stuff out to start with, but we generally don't have them doing sort of longer writing in class.
I'm going to ask you one more question, just because a few people have asked it in different
Okay.
forms. They are all super interested in your work, and they're asking, can they get a free trial? And was there a reason why you published it the way you did rather than as an OER?
That is an excellent question. And when our relationship with unnamed large publishing company fell apart, that's what we intended to do. Amy has an open intermediate program called Accesso, which is wonderful. And so we thought, yeah, we'll just do it open. There are some problems with that. Primarily tech support, backend data, and gradebook are things that you can't have reliably in OER unless you build it, you know, in your own Canvas or whatever your learning management system is.
Right.
So we felt like we wouldn't really be able to do everything we wanted, a fully integrated program that we could then make available widely. We do, though, we've said the starting price is no more than $75 a semester, which, so, you know, we have a lot of people, I don't know about you guys, but we have a lot of people who only take beginning Spanish 2, for example, because they don't need 1 and 2. And so that way they're not paying for the whole thing. If you use it over 3 semesters, it's a reduced cost even further. As for free sample, that's really hard, right? Because there's nothing anybody can mail you, but there are webinars and walkthroughs available on the website. It's lingrolearning.com.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
𝘧𝘭𝘢𝘵, our outreach coordinator is here. 𝘧𝘭𝘢𝘵, would you mind putting the link to the evaluation into the text, into the chat, please? Dr. Lord, thank you very much for doing this presentation, and I will send you the other questions, you know, after the event. I can see all these people who are saying thank you.
No, I just opened that up. Thank you all.
Hopefully you're seeing that as well. I also wanted to say that we have another webinar on May 18th. Do you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, we have a webinar on May 18th. If anybody is interested in attending that one is also free. The link is up there on the right. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much again, Dr. Lord, for participating, and then everybody else who attended this presentation.